The gavel came down, and a fraudulent debt paper said Jedidiah Cole owned a woman. Federal law said otherwise. New Mexico Territory, 1888. He hadn't meant to bid. He'd ridden 2 days to that roadside auction in the New Mexico heat for nothing more than a good horse. But when they dragged her out of that iron cage, sun blistered and silent. Something moved in his chest before his brain could stop it. His hand went up. The number left his mouth before he understood why. The crowd laughed at him. They called her the Marked One. They said she'd cut a man's throat in Silver City. They said worse things than that, the kind of things men say about a woman they've already decided isn't a person anymore. Jedidiah didn't care what they said. He cared about the small star-shaped brand on her wrist, its healed scar pale enough to look silver beneath a torn sleeve, and about the way the auctioneer's eyes flickered with something close to fear every time he glanced at it. He didn't know it yet, but he had just freed the only living witness still carrying physical proof of a crime big enough to shake the whole territory. He paid the price of a fine horse, made the auctioneer sign over the fabricated debt claim, and had her chain opened before he stepped away from the table. Whatever that paper had pretended to make her, it no longer bound her to him or anyone else. She didn't thank him. She didn't cry. She looked at him instead, amber eyes steady, like a woman who'd already seen the end of the world and walked out the other side of it. And in that look, Jedidiah Cole felt something he hadn't let himself feel in 11 years. He felt seen, and it terrified him. He should have asked her name right then. He didn't. Some silences take longer to break than others, and hers, he'd soon learn, had been building for 2 years. The other bidders that day weren't buying lawful labor. Congress had outlawed peonage in New Mexico years earlier, but Miller's people had learned to hide the old abuse behind invented debts, private custody papers, and roadside sales held far from anyone likely to challenge them. Everyone at that auction understood the unspoken rule. The paper was a pretense. The cage was intimidation. And the marked prisoner was meant to be a warning made flesh. Jedidiah paid because he couldn't stand watching her stand in that cage one more minute. He would understand later just how much that single decision had cost him, and how much it would eventually give him back. Jedidiah was a man made of silence. 10 years scouting for cavalry columns through New Mexico's long frontier campaigns had carved it into him, one dead friend at a time. He'd left that work 11 years earlier, with no medals worth hanging and no laughter left in him. Folks in the nearest town said he'd forgotten how to smile. Nobody said it to be cruel. They said it because it was true. There had been a winter 11 years back that he never spoke of out loud, not even to himself if he could help it. He'd led 11 men into a canyon he'd scouted the week before and sworn was clear. The report he'd filed said clear. He believed it when he wrote it. He remembered the sound before he remembered anything else. Not gunfire at first. Hoofbeats on rock. Wrong ones. Coming from the wrong direction. From a ridge he'd walked himself and marked as empty. He remembered the young private beside him, a boy from Ohio who still wrote his mother every week, turning to ask if that was thunder. It wasn't thunder. By the time Jedidiah understood what it was, half his column was already pinned against a wall of stone with nowhere to run and nothing to trade for the mistake but their own blood. He'd fought that night the way he'd been trained to, and it hadn't been enough. He remembered dragging the Ohio boy behind a boulder with a wound in his side too wide to close with anything they carried, and holding his hand while he stopped writing letters forever. He remembered counting afterward, in the gray light before dawn, and coming up 6 men short of what he'd started with, and 1 more short of that by sunrise, when a 7th man succumbed to wounds he'd been too proud to admit were fatal. The report he filed afterwards said clear, because he had believed it when he wrote it, and that was the part that never left him. Not the deaths themselves, the certainty that had come before them. He had trusted his own eyes completely, and his own eyes had been wrong, and good men had paid for that wrongness in a canyon that didn't even have a name on most maps. The ambush that followed took most of a night to finish. Only 4 men rode out with him by morning, and one of those 4 never spoke a full sentence again for the rest of his life. Jedidiah carried that morning the way some men carry a limp, quiet, permanent, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look for it. He built his cabin deep in the Red Canyons after that, where the rock walls kept the world out and the ghosts in, and he told himself a man could survive on silence alone, if he had to. He had not trusted his own judgment fully since, not about people, not about danger, not about anything that mattered, until an auctioneer's gavel came down over a woman in an iron cage, and some old instinct he thought the canyon had killed for good quietly opened one eye. He was wrong about that too. He just didn't know it yet. The first 2 days of the ride back toward his cabin passed with the woman saying almost nothing at all. She tended the horse's wounds with a skill that made Jedidiah's breath catch. She knew exactly where to press, exactly how to clean and dress a saddle sore, exactly how to calm a spooked animal with nothing but a flat palm against its neck. She watched the horizon the way a woman watches weather that's about to turn. Careful, unblinking, like she understood, better than he did, that evil in this territory wore a great many ordinary faces. On the second night, by the fire, Jedidiah finally saw the star on her wrist up close. It wasn't a tattoo at all. It was a deliberate brand. The healed scar turned pale and silver white against her skin, the kind of mark made by people who wanted their victims recognized later. "Who did this to you?" he said. Not a question, a promise. She stared into the fire so long he thought she wouldn't answer at all. "My father built clocks," she finally whispered. Her first words to him in 2 days. He knew too much about the coins, so they killed him. Jedidiah didn't move. He'd expected a crime. He hadn't expected a murder that still had teeth. Her name was Elara Doss. She was no criminal. She was a clockmaker's daughter from a small mining settlement outside Silver City, where the men who killed her father had spent 2 years teaching people that remembering him was dangerous. She carried one object through those 2 years of running, a small, cracked pocket watch, her father's last gift, its casing dented from being carried through more danger than any watch was built to survive. Hidden behind the watch movement was a thin silver trial strike her father had made from the counterfeit die before it went into production. A flaw cut into one edge matched the same defect appearing on false dollars, now moving through banks and mining camps across the territory. It was not enough by itself to convict a network, but it was physical evidence that could lead federal investigators back to the dies, the ledgers, and the men who profited from them. "Then we fixed the watch," Jedidiah said when she finished. "And we finished what your father started." Something shifted in her face. Not relief. She wasn't ready for relief yet. Something more careful than that. Something that looked, for the first time since the auction, like she was allowing herself to believe she might not be alone in this anymore. Later that same night, when the fire had burned low and neither of them was ready to sleep, Jedidiah finally asked the question he'd been carrying since the auction block. Why a star? Why silver? And why the wrist, where it couldn't be hidden under a sleeve without effort? Elara explained it the way someone explains a wound that stopped bleeding, but never fully closed. The mark wasn't territorial law. It was Miller's private warning, used by deputies, creditors, and hired men tied to his counterfeit network. After her father was killed, Miller's men had branded her, circulated the story that she was a thief and a killer, and made sure innkeepers, employers, bankers, and local deputies recognized the scar before they ever heard her side. The mark had no lawful power to stop her from testifying, renting a room, or marrying. Miller's influence did the rest. Doors closed, complaints vanished, and people learned that helping someone with the silver star could bring trouble to their own homes. The mark didn't erase her rights. It made exercising them dangerous, exactly the way Miller needed while he hunted her at his leisure. "So when you paid that false debt and put your name on the transfer," she said quietly, "you didn't just get me out of a cage. Everyone who saw it happen knew you'd put yourself between Miller and someone he'd marked." Jedidiah hadn't thought that far ahead at the auction. He thought about it now, turning the pocket watch over once in his hands before passing it back to her. "Then I suppose we're both marked now," he said. "I can live with that." For the first time, Elara reached over and took his hand, not for warmth against the desert cold, but simply because she wanted to. Neither of them let go for a long while. The desert had other plans for them. The crossing to the Red Canyons turned brutal within a day. Water ran low faster than either of them liked to admit. The horizon shimmered with false rivers that vanished the closer they rode toward them. And twice Elara caught Jedidiah staring too long at nothing, the way a man stares when his mind has wandered back to a canyon he can't stop revisiting. She never asked him about it. She simply rode closer, until their stirrups nearly touched, until his eyes cleared again. She never said a word about doing it. He never thanked her for it out loud. But he noticed. He noticed everything about her now, and that noticing frightened him more than the fever that hadn't come yet. On the third day, a rattlesnake spooked Elara's mare hard enough to throw her. And for one terrible half-second, Jedidiah's whole world narrowed down to the sight of her hitting the sand. She rose before he even reached her, dust in her hair, already laughing, actually laughing, bright and startled and alive, at the absurdity of surviving an iron cage only to nearly be undone by a snake and a scared horse. Jedidiah felt his own face do something unfamiliar in response. He smiled. It startled him more than it startled her. But the desert wasn't finished testing them. 3 nights into the crossing, a thorn fragment buried in Jedidiah's forearm left the wound hot, swollen, and angry by the following day, and fever followed. Elara became the protector then. She found and removed the remaining thorn, cleaned the wound repeatedly with boiled water, kept it covered with clean cloth, forced water and bitter willow tea past his cracked lips, and sat up through 2 long nights keeping the fire alive while the fever ran its course. Her father had taught her enough about plants and wounds to know what might ease pain and what had to be kept clean, back before coins and blood and running had replaced clocks as the center of her world. "Don't you dare," she told him once, gripping his hand so hard her knuckles went white. "I did not survive that cage to watch you die in the sand." He survived. Barely. And something between them had quietly, permanently changed, the kind of change neither of them said out loud, because saying it out loud would have made it real, and real things could still be taken away. On the 5th day, with Jedidiah still weak from the fever, they lost the trail markers he'd been navigating by, and for 6 hours neither of them would say the word that was on both their minds. Lost. The Red Canyons all looked the same from certain angles. Red rock stacked on red rock under a sky bleached white with heat. And every ridge they climbed to get their bearings revealed 3 more ridges that looked exactly like it. It was Elara who solved it, not Jedidiah. She remembered a trick her father had taught her as a girl, using the prevailing lean of dry brush only as one clue, then checking it against the afternoon sun and a split ridge Jedidiah had described before the fever. Together those signs put the canyon entrance a full quarter turn from where Jedidiah, still fever-fogged, had been certain they should go. He didn't argue with her. That surprised him more than the fever had. 11 years of second-guessing every judgment that mattered, including his own, and he handed his life over to a woman he'd known less than 2 weeks without a second thought. "You're sure," he said anyway, half a question, half an old habit he couldn't quite kill yet. "No," she admitted. "But I'm less wrong than you are right now." He laughed. It came out rough, unused, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. She glanced at him sideways, something like surprise and something like satisfaction crossing her face at once, and neither of them mentioned it again. They didn't need to. They reached the cabin at dawn 3 days later, exactly where her reading of the wind had promised, and for a while. It felt like peace might actually be possible. By lamplight, Elara worked on the watch, her fingers steady despite everything the object represented. When the tiny hidden compartment finally clicked open, revealing the thin silver trial strike behind the movement, she didn't celebrate. She wept, quietly, for the father she'd lost. For 2 years spent running from men who'd never once stopped looking, for a danger that everyone in that cabin knew was far from over. Jedidiah sat beside her and said nothing. Sometimes staying is the only thing a man has to offer. That night, close to the fire, she finally let herself lean into him. He finally let himself hold someone again, for the first time since the canyon that took 7 men and left him standing. Peace never lasts long in the Red Canyons. It hadn't come to say hello. It had come to say goodbye. Sheriff Elias Miller was not a common outlaw. That was what made him dangerous. A common outlaw could be outshot. Miller carried a badge, and a badge in the wrong hands wasn't a weapon you could see coming. He'd built half his fortune on the very silver Elara's father had died trying to expose, and he had spent 2 years hunting her, not with wanted posters at first, but quietly, patiently, the way a man hunts something he already knows he'll eventually corner. Miller understood something most outlaws never bothered to learn. A gun could take a life. A rumor could take everything else first, and it left no powder burns for a judge to ask questions about. When word reached him that a rancher named Cole had bought the marked one clean out of a public auction, Miller didn't panic. He went to work the way he always did, one conversation at a time, each one small enough to seem harmless on its own. He started with Thomas Hargrove, who ran the general store and owed Miller a favor from a bad debt quietly forgiven 2 winters back. Over coffee, Miller mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd heard troubling things about the woman Cole had taken into the hills. He didn't say what things. He let Hargrove's imagination fill that silence in for him, and Hargrove filled it generously. He moved next to Reverend Adair, a decent man who had never once turned away a stranger in need, and to him Miller framed it differently. Not danger, but duty. Didn't the Reverend think it was his Christian responsibility to speak from the pulpit about the corrupting influence a fugitive woman might have on a solitary troubled man like Cole? The Reverend, who genuinely believed he was protecting a lost soul, preached exactly the sermon Miller needed the following Sunday, and never once suspected he'd been used as a weapon. By the time the wanted posters went up naming Jedidiah Cole a kidnapper, Miller barely had to write the lie himself. Hargrove had already told 6 customers his version. The Reverend had already told an entire congregation his. The town had convicted Jedidiah in whispers before a single official word was printed, because Miller had given each man just enough reason to believe it on his own, and let their own decency do the rest of the damage for him. That was the difference between a bully and a true manipulator, and it was the reason Miller had worn a badge for 11 years without a single vote ever going against him. It worked exactly as Miller intended. The town that had once respected Jedidiah's silence now feared it. Old friends crossed the street rather than meet his eyes. Everything he'd spent 11 quiet years building, his name, his standing, the fragile peace he'd made with being alone, Miller burned down in a single week of well-placed lies without ever firing a shot. Jedidiah rode in for supplies 4 days after the posters went up, still not knowing they existed. He found out the way a man finds out he's already lost something, by feeling its absence before he understands the cause. The street that used to nod at him went quiet instead. A woman pulled her son back onto the boardwalk as he passed, like proximity itself was catching. Outside the general store, 3 men he'd known for a decade wouldn't meet his eyes at all, and when he finally saw his own face staring back at him from a wanted poster nailed to the post office wall, the word kidnapper printed beneath it in bold black letters, he understood exactly what Miller had built while he'd been tending a fever miles away. He didn't defend himself. 11 years of silence hadn't taught him how. And some part of him, the part still carrying that canyon from 11 years back, half believed he deserved whatever the town decided about him. He rode home instead, said nothing to Elara about it that night, and only told her the truth 2 days later when she found the folded poster he'd stuffed at the bottom of his saddlebag rather than burn it. She didn't apologize for what her past had cost him. She simply asked if he regretted it. No, he said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in 11 years. Ask me again after this is over. I still won't regret it. He didn't need to fire a shot to know the town had already convicted him. Miller had 6 men riding for him instead, and a sandstorm on the way that would cover whatever they did next. The storm hit the canyon at dusk, turning the world to swirling red dust and screaming wind, and Miller's men used every second of it. They surrounded the cabin expecting an easy kill, a lonely rancher and a fugitive woman, no match for 6 armed riders under cover of a storm. They were wrong on both counts, and it cost them. Jedidiah moved through that chaos like the scout he used to be, using the canyon walls and the blinding dust as cover the way he once used terrain to keep men alive who never made it home. This time, the terrain listened to him. This time, it worked. And Elara, quiet, careful Elara, put a rifle to her shoulder and fired with a precision that told Jedidiah exactly how she'd survived 2 years alone in a territory built to break her. Then came the moment everything nearly ended. A bullet grazed Jedidiah's side, and he went down hard into the dirt. Elara screamed his name into the storm, certain for one unbearable second that she was about to lose the only person who'd looked at her like she was still human. The world narrowed to sand, blood, and the sound of her own heartbeat hammering louder than the gunfire. Then he rose, bloodied, but standing. And together, back to back in the swirling red dust, they held that line until Miller's men broke and ran into the storm, leaving one man dead and another wounded behind. The wounded rider surrendered. In his coat, Jedidiah found written instructions ordering the men to regroup with Miller at the abandoned mission 2 days east if the cabin attack failed. They didn't run from Miller after that. With his written rendezvous order and a surviving witness to the cabin attack, they rode to intercept him before he could disappear, intending to take him alive to federal authorities if he surrendered. 2 days later, following the written rendezvous instructions, they reached the crumbling ruins of an old Spanish mission and finally cornered him. Stone walls half collapsed, a bell tower gone silent 50 years earlier standing as the only witness. Jedidiah took the high ground first, exactly the way a scout would, climbing what remained of the bell tower stairs while Elara circled wide through the old cloister to cover the only door out. It was the first plan he'd trusted completely since that canyon 11 years ago, and he trusted it because half of it belonged to her. Miller had 4 men left, positioned badly, more concerned with the mission's shadows than with the crumbling roofline above them. Jedidiah picked off their position from above before they ever located him, forcing 2 of them into the open courtyard where Elara was waiting, rifle already steady. The remaining 2 broke for the horses rather than test their luck further, leaving Miller alone against the altar with nowhere left to run and no lie left that anyone would believe. For one long moment, it looked like Miller might still talk his way out of it. He always had before. He raised his hands, calm as a man ordering breakfast, and started explaining how this was all a misunderstanding that could still be settled quietly, favorably, for everyone involved, if the woman would just hand over that broken watch and let bygones stay buried where they belonged. He was still talking when his hand moved for the gun at his hip. Jedidiah saw it a half second before Elara did, and that half second was the only warning either of them needed. Miller went for his gun anyway. He was faster than most men his age, and slower than Jedidiah Cole by half a second that mattered more than anything Miller had ever counted on. It ended there, in the mission's broken shadow, after Miller chose his gun over surrender. What followed would still have to be explained to federal authorities, but it had not been an execution. They carried the watch, the trial strike, Miller's written orders, and the surviving rider's statement to a United States Marshal 3 weeks later. A Treasury Secret Service operative was brought into the case because counterfeiting was federal business. The investigation compared the distinctive defect on Elara's trial strike with seized false dollars, then followed bank ledgers, shipments, and testimony through Miller's network county by county. Men who had once tipped their hats to Miller in the street now avoided saying his name at all. And the town that had once called Elara the Marked One, that had once looked away when Jedidiah Cole walked past, slowly began to understand exactly what they had witnessed. Thomas Hargrove was among the first to ride out to the Red Canyons that spring, hat in hand. Unable to look either of them in the eye at first, offering supplies at no charge for as long as they'd let him. Reverend Adair rode out not long after, and this time he didn't come to preach. He came to apologize, and to ask, quietly, if Elara would ever consider letting him make it right in whatever way she'd allow. She forgave him. She told Jedidiah later that forgiving him had been harder than facing Miller's gun, and easier than she expected, all at once. It didn't erase what had been done. Elara never pretended it did. 2 years of running, a father unavenged for far too long, a brand on her wrist that would never fade no matter how the town's opinion of her changed. None of that undid itself simply because people finally chose to see clearly. But it was, in its own slow and imperfect way, a kind of justice too, the kind that doesn't come with a gavel, only with ordinary people finally admitting they had been wrong. Jedidiah rebuilt his cabin that spring, wider than before, with a second chimney and a porch big enough for 2 rocking chairs he'd carved himself, badly, with hands more used to rifles than tools. Elara never once complained about the crooked joints. She said a house built imperfectly by hands that cared was worth more than one built perfectly by hands that didn't, and he chose to believe she meant it. Months later, a courthouse gavel ended the morning docket before a small wedding began. Hargrove closed his store for the afternoon to attend. Reverend Adair, this time invited rather than assumed, spoke words that actually belonged to the 2 people standing in front of him instead of words meant to serve someone else's purpose. Elara wore her father's watch, fully repaired now, on a chain around her neck, its hidden compartment finally empty of secrets, holding nothing anymore but the quiet fact that it still kept perfect time. There was no cage that day, no auctioneer, no crowd laughing at either of them. Just a handful of people who had, in their own imperfect ways, learned to see 2 strangers clearly. Jedidiah stood at the front of that small courthouse room in a shirt Elara had pressed for him that morning, and when she walked toward him, he realized he was smiling before he told his face to do it, the same way he had that first week in the Red Canyons, except now there was nothing unfamiliar about it at all. It had simply become who he was. Somewhere outside, past the courthouse steps, the same New Mexico wind that had carried dust across an auction block months earlier moved quietly through the street. And for once, neither of them flinched at the sound of it. Jedidiah Cole had bought a woman's freedom for the price of a horse. What he got in return, in the end, was a reason to smile again. A name worth trusting once more. And a home in the Red Canyons that finally, after 11 long years, no longer echoed with anything but the sound of 2 people who intended to stay. If this story of mystery and honor on the American frontier found its way into your heart tonight, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of unlikely heroes on the edge of the Old West. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from tonight? Thanks for riding along. See you in the next story.